Today, we are joined again by Mr. Ilya Shapiro. He is the former head of constitutional studies at the Cato Institute. He is a constitutional lawyer and most recently, about a year ago, wrote the book Supreme Disorder, which was the subject of his last appearance on the show. You're actually the very first returning guest that I have. So,
a special prize for that, no doubt.
Yeah.
You'll have to double my pay.
Yeah. I don't know how much I get paid. So either way, Mr. Shapiro is on today. We are going to discuss the latest Supreme Court nomination from Joe Biden following the resignation of Stephen Breyer. And I know that you have a lot to say about that. I heard your name came up in the news recently, too, following a lecture you gave at Georgetown.
So I was due to join the Georgetown Law School faculty as senior lecturer and executive director of the Center for the Constitution on February 1st. A few days before then was when the news of the Breyer retirement leaked. And after a day of commenting and blogging about this, late at night I was scrolling through Twitter, bad idea, and fired off a hot take criticizing President Biden's decision to limit his pool of candidates by race and sex. And I phrased it a little poorly, not like I'd want to. And so the next morning, after I saw that everything was hitting the fan on social media, I took down the post and apologized for my inartful language. But at that point, the scandal was brewing, and eventually I was onboarded at Georgetown, but was immediately placed on administrative leave pending investigation into whether my comments violated any university policy. And 10 weeks later, still in purgatory. So that's where things stand.
On that note, do you think maybe you could go into a little bit of detail regarding your position on Biden's criteria, basically his pool of candidates, and just for the sake of the argument, why the way he's going about it, basing it on things like gender or race, why that is a bad idea?
Right. Well, historically, there have been a lot of considerations that presidents have used when making Supreme Court nominations. Regional balance. There was a New England seat and a Southern seat and a Northwestern seat, etc. Eventually California when it joined the Union, things like that. So regional considerations, intra-party factions, different aspects. Politics played a role from the very beginning in that way. Eventually there became a Catholic seat and then a Jewish seat, things like that. And of course, Democratic presidents in modern times have tried to promote demographic diversity within the judiciary in general, in the lower courts, especially starting with Jimmy Carter, and now reaching the high court. Now, President Biden, unlike most of his predecessors, didn't go about doing kind of a holistic search of people and happened to nominate a member of a racial minority. He said at the outset, "I'm going to pick a black woman." And I think that that kind of explicit racial and gender bias or preference is inappropriate. That you should look at limiting a pool based on those kinds of immutable characteristics for high office, especially, but any office really is against basic principles of equality. And so. It's not that the eventual nominee, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, is unqualified, but that a lot of people who were qualified simply weren't considered because of their race or gender. And so President Biden, I think, rightly got criticism about that, and I certainly wasn't the only one. There was a poll on ABC News poll a few days after the Breyer retirement announcement that said 76% of Americans said that the president should not limit his search to black women, but here we are.
I mean, yeah, if this were even 10 years ago, that would have been common conventional wisdom. But I feel like ever since 2014, especially, Is with all the identity politics creeping up, it seems like principles that would have once been considered liberal are like on trial right now in a lot of respects. But yeah, do you think you can go into some detail based on your knowledge of Biden's new Supreme Court nominee for the audience? You can explain where she stands on issues like, I don't know, judicial activism, what her legal philosophy is from what you know, and what ramifications or consequences might ultimately come about.
As we're recording this, the Judiciary Committee, we're recording this Monday, April 4th. The Judiciary Committee they were supposed to already have voted, but there was a delay because one of the senators was delayed from in getting back to Washington. So we assume that later today, at some point this evening, maybe there'll be a vote, which will be 12-12. When that happens, there's what's called a discharge petition to get the nomination onto the Senate floor. For Supreme Court nominations, that hasn't happened since 1853, but she'll be discharged. The Democrats do have a majority, after all, slim as it is, in the Senate, and presumably later this week she'll be confirmed with a very narrow margin. So far, only one Republican, Susan Collins, has announced that she's going to vote for Judge Jackson. Two others, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Mitt Romney of Utah, are the only other possible yes votes on the Republican side. So that's how narrow the margin will be. But regardless, that's where we stand politically. But back to your question on the substance, this issue of judicial philosophy came up again and again, especially Senator Sass and Senator Lee asked Judge Jackson at the confirmation hearings 2 weeks ago to explain her judicial philosophy. And what she said was that she didn't have as she said a year ago when she was being confirmed to the D.C. Circuit, she doesn't have a philosophy per se. She has a methodology. And the methodology involves first clearing her mind, make sure she's not predisposed to one side or another, reading both parties' briefs, looking at the facts of the case, and applying the relevant law. Now, that didn't really satisfy anyone. In fact, none of what was said, I think, during the hearing changed a single vote, either in favor or against the nomination. This methodology that Judge Jackson explained, I think every judge has that methodology. That's the definition of being a judge. The question is different. It's how, what is your theory behind interpreting provisions of the Constitution or legal provisions that aren't explicit? Not the Constitution says the president has to be 35 years of age. Okay, that's pretty clear. But what is interstate commerce, or what is a reasonable search or seizure that doesn't require a warrant? For example, there are parts of the Constitution that require something beyond just a mechanical input into a machine. It's not just calling balls and strikes in the kind of also simplistic phraseology of John Roberts 17 years ago now. So we don't know what her philosophy is, although based on her cases and her opinions that are written, there's not that much that we can tell there either. She's mostly been a district court judge, a trial level judge, and so Republicans focused on her sentencing, what she did, especially with sex offenders, child pornography, and was she more lenient than other district court judges? It's fair game, although Supreme Court justices don't get involved in that. But basically, based on the outside interest groups that were supporting her and the perception that of the shortlisters, so there were two other judges who were considered a district judge in South Carolina, Michelle Childs, and a California Supreme Court Justice Leondra Kruger. The perception is that Judge Jackson was the most progressive, the most to the left of those, and nothing that we heard about her philosophy or how she portrays herself dispelled any of that, even though her record of achievement professionally, her poise, her composure under pressure, all of those things say good things about her character and her qualifications. But again, it's that aspect of legal theory and judicial philosophy that I think give a lot of the Republican senators, even the more moderate ones that had voted for her in the past, pause about voting to confirm at this point.
Yeah, I feel like it's like that just when, for example, one party controls the executive, and the executive, of course, is responsible for nominating the judges. But even like if the opposition would have confirmed them as federal judges, it just seems like whenever the other parties has executive control, no matter who they nominate, even if it was somebody who was previously confirmed on the federal level, it seems like they're always in opposition to it.
I mean, the thing is, it's not about the nominees themselves anymore. Through a period of escalations, tit for tat escalations by both party, we're at a point where it's hard to see how a Senate of the opposing party to the president will ever again confirm a Supreme Court justice, at least given the current dynamic. Because what we have is the culmination of several trends where, first of all, the Supreme Court is very powerful. Over decades, power has centralized in Washington, and within Washington in the administrative state, which can't be unelected. Of course, it can only be sued. So a lot of big disputes end up in the courts. And at the same time, we have divergent interpretive theories that map onto partisan preference or identification at a time when the parties are more ideologically sorted and polarized than they've been since at least the Civil War. You know, there are no Republican senators more to the left of any Democratic senators, and vice versa. And that certainly was not always the case. So, you know, every nomination, every vacancy is going to be fraught. I mean, especially when it signals a shift in jurisprudence. So the reason why the Thomas nomination back in 1991, which was the last one with a Senate controlled by the opposite party to the president, but it was Clarence Thomas replacing Thurgood Marshall, which is a huge shift. Brett Kavanaugh replacing the swing vote, the median vote, Anthony Kennedy, was a big deal. That's why his nomination hearings exploded. And Amy Coney Barrett replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, also a huge shift. And that's why that was big and controversial. This one right now, Jackson replacing Breyer, is like for like. She's certainly to the left of Breyer, but at the end of the day, on the most controversial cases, the vote's not going to be very different. But we are where we are, where very few opposite party votes are gettable. Only 3 Democrats voted for Neil Gorsuch. Only 2 voted for Kavanaugh. None voted for Amy Coney Barrett. So, as I said, only 1 to 3 Republicans are going to vote for Jackson now. So we're really at a point where they're pure party line votes.
Do you think that precedent regarding the polarization in terms of confirming Supreme Court justices, do you think that precedent was set with Merrick Garland, or does it go back earlier than that?
Much earlier. I'd say it starts even before, so to kind of list out all of these controversies. A lot of people start with Robert Bork in 1987, who was the first nominee.
That's right.
Assailed for judicial philosophy. It really, before that, as long as someone with generally acceptable qualifications, did well in law school, had high-profile, successful career as a lawyer and a lower court judge, that was going to be an easy confirmation. But Bork was, questioned about his philosophy, whether it was outside the mainstream, etc. And he did not adopt the, refused to be coached, really was not his own best friend, refused to be coached, and treated it like an academic seminar, answered in depth and in full about every legal issue, no matter how controversial, rather than adopting the now common strategy of speaking a lot without saying very much. Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1991, just 4 years later, was very good at this pincer movement of saying, I can't talk about specifics because they might come before the court, and I can't talk about general principles because judges should only deal in specifics. And that's been the standard playbook. But anyway, after Bork was rejected, there was another historical footnote after him. Eventually, Anthony Kennedy was confirmed to that seat. But Douglas Ginsburg was the next nominee by President Reagan, but he withdrew before Reagan could even send his name to the Senate for having smoked marijuana with his law students. And that I consider the last public casualty of the drug war. When you think about it, no other public official in the last 35 years has suffered for revelations of drug use. But anyway, after Bork came Thomas in 1991. Ginsburg was 93. I misspoke. But anyway, Thomas in 1991, the so-called high-tech lynching, as he called it, reopening the hearings for discussions of sexual harassment allegations. He was still confirmed, even though the Democrats had a narrow majority in the Senate. Then in the early Bush years, George W. Bush's president, you had filibustering of his lower court nominees to prevent, for example, Miguel Estrada from being on the D.C. Circuit and potentially becoming the first Hispanic justice. Janice Rogers Brown, this came up during Judge Jackson's hearings, and even today during the discussions of before the vote in the Judiciary Committee, how she was filibustered, including by the Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin, including by Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, and she could have potentially become the first Black woman justice. Then Merrick Garland in 2016, even before Garland was announced as the nominee, when Justice Scalia died, then Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "No hearings, no votes. It's an election year, too close to the election. We're going to hold this seat open." After President Obama was reelected in 2012, and then Republicans won the Senate in 2014, McConnell said, "We're going to let the American people break the tie, to decide who gets to appoint."
That's kind of fun. I just want to say that's kind of funny, especially given what eventually happened with Barrett.
Right.
Well, this is the thing. Again, they're all hypocrites. Yeah.
So this was an argument not about the nominee, Garland, or anyone else. And President Obama tried to pick the most moderate, plausible Democratic nominee, which was Garland. He was older. He was 61 at the time. Nobody so old has been confirmed, by the way. Ginsburg was 60. The only person above 55 confirmed since 1970, I believe it is. But anyway, Garland did not get a hearing or a vote. And then when Donald Trump surprisingly won the election, he nominated Justice Gorsuch. The Democrats forced McConnell to get rid of the filibuster to confirm Gorsuch. But then the Democrats themselves, 4 years earlier, when Harry Reid was majority leader, got rid of the filibuster for lower court nominees when the Republicans were filibustering lower court nominees. So tit for tat escalation, the Kavanaugh hearings and the explosion. And then when Justice Ginsburg died on the eve of the election in 2020, at that point, Mitch McConnell said that the rule was if you don't have united government. I mean, again, these are all political gamesmanship. The last time the Senate failed to act on a nominee was 1881, but the last time the Senate of an opposite party to the president confirmed someone to a vacancy arising in a presidential election year was 1888. It just doesn't happen either way. It's pure power politics, whichever way you cut it. So series of escalations, and now we have what we have. Complete the go back to the original circle. Yeah. I don't think this started with Bork. I think really the inflection point was 1968. I write about this in my book, Supreme Disorder, which, by the way, is coming out in paperback July 5th. So I just finished the epilogue. I'm going to put in the final details about the final vote on Judge Jackson, and away we go. So you can get the hardcover for cheap right now, and then get the update with the paperback in the summer. But I think 1968, for our political culture, for our society as a whole, and for our legal culture, that's when LBJ's attempt to elevate Justice Abe Fortas was stopped. It was a bipartisan filibuster for ethics concerns. And Richard Nixon campaigned on replacing Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was seen as a big activist, unpopular, became a big political issue. And for the first time, President Nixon campaigned on the Supreme Court, talked about strict constructionism, these sorts of things. Legal philosophy, judicial philosophy became a major issue rather than simply the politics that had been part of the process from the very beginning.
Growing up, especially starting around 2009, I always remember the Republicans mostly being the obstructionists around the time of Obama.
That's showing your age. It's when you're coming of age. There was stuff under Bush. There was stuff under Clinton even. I mean, every president going back to even before Bork, there were some trial runs at obstruction by the Democrats. Jeff Sessions, I know I'm going off on a tangent. Jeff Sessions, who was, of course, Attorney General under Donald Trump before having a falling out, was nominated to the federal district court in Alabama in the 80s before Bork. And he was opposed as kind of a bit of a playbook of what the Democrats eventually did in a larger scheme with the Bork nomination. And of course, before that, I mean, you can point to, there's both. Neither party has clean hands and can argue about who started it.
I remember throughout the Obama years, the Republicans would go out of their way pretty much to obstruct almost everything that Obama trying to pass in the Senate or any kind of legislation. But especially then during Trump's presidency, each time he tried to nominate a justice for the Supreme Court, it became a really big deal, especially with Kavanaugh. The Democrats went completely off the rails. And I notice it's kind of interesting how, at least from what I've seen, the Republicans are actually being way more civil than I remember them historically being, at least this time around.
It depends what you measure them against. The Washington Post said that the Republicans treated Judge Jackson worse than the Democrats treated Kavanaugh, which is ridiculous. I don't think that, there were some hard questions certainly for Jackson, but there were hard questions every time around. And sure, there was senatorial bloviation and playing for the cameras to get your B-roll for your reelection campaign or your presidential campaign for that matter. But no, these hearings were relatively civilized. And indeed, when we point to huge scandals, we generally talk about, we talk about Kavanaugh, we talk about Thomas, Bork, and stonewalling Garland, which of course was not about him. It was, as I said, about the, making the argument principled or not about the presidential election year vacancy. So, I'm not here to argue one side is better than the other, but certainly Kavanaugh probably got it the worst. Kavanaugh or Thomas. And with Kavanaugh, you have to remember, even before the 11th hour accusations of sexual impropriety, the initial hearing was the Democrats had their little rolling filibuster. It took Chuck Grassley an hour and a half to get through his 10-minute opening remarks. That was a complaint about, get this, the Bush library not releasing documents from Kavanaugh having served in the Bush White House, that quaint issue. And then there was all sorts of things that we don't remember at this point. Cory Booker's Spartacus moment, that he was ready to be censured and fired from the Senate. Just protesters, the handmaids dressed up because, of course, Kavanaugh was appointed to subvert women's rights and all this. Again, this was all before the Kristen Blasey Ford and the accusations of serial gang rape and Michael Avenatti and all the rest of the stuff. Truly an unusual circumstance.
The hilarious thing about that is that Kavanaugh is essentially the swing vote at this point.
He's the median vote. I wouldn't call him the swing, but that's true. The last term, for example, we'll see what happens this term, but the last term he was in the majority more than anyone else, all but two cases. And it's not because I don't think he's like Kennedy in that he kind of like sometimes goes left, sometimes goes right, but he's essentially represents the middle of the court jurisprudentially.
Okay. So where do you see Jackson, assuming she does end up getting confirmed, just at least from what you do know about her, where do you think she is going to sit on the bench? Do you think she's going to be to the left of Sotomayor, or do you think she's going to be more towards the middle?
It's somewhere around there. Whether she'll be to the left of Sotomayor or not is kind of, at this point, it's just a parlor game. We'll see. The proof will be in the pudding, but she's definitely to the left of Breyer and also Kagan. Probably not going to be the same sort of consensus builder or as influential as Kagan has been in catching the attention of Roberts and Kavanaugh. I've heard it said that, for example, it's kind of a clever comment that even though she's to the left of Breyer, or at least generally speaking, it's a very broad generalization, her confirmation will move the court to the right, which is a counterintuitive sentiment, because she will have less influence over the more centrist Republican appointees. It's an interesting prediction. We'll see if it's borne out.
Clarence Thomas came up in the news lately related to his wife supporting the Capitol insurrection. I don't know how accurate that is, but while we're talking about Supreme Court justices, is there anything specific related to that controversy that you might have to add?
So she apparently texted with Mark Meadows from the January 6th committee. There was a leak of text messages. Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, urging him to do everything he can to stop the steal of the election and get Trump in power. Now, multiple things here. normally especially those on the left don't think that someone should be painted with whatever one's spouse is doing. Ginny Thomas is an independent person and her own professional, does what she wants to do. Doesn't mean that Justice Thomas either shares her views or acted on them in one ruling where he was the sole dissent in the decision about subpoenas regarding the January 6th committee and document disclosures and things like that. Some left-wing activists are now calling on him not just to recuse, but to resign over this. I don't think anything is going to come of that. Look, they're separate people. Now, whether it's wise for her to be doing this, given that she's the justice's wife, is a separate question of whether, he's done anything wrong or shouldn't be considering certain types of cases.
Going back to the incident at Georgetown, and I know, especially the tune of the past year and a half has been cancel culture. It's really kind of mostly invoked by people who lean more towards the right to refer to that particular brand of left-wing activist. Of course, I mean, we see it on both sides, but because you were essentially canceled for stating your opinion, even though you said that you could have stated it better, what does that feel like? Where do you see this going?
People facing significant consequences for saying things that either are inartful or politically incorrect. I think in the end, I'll probably end up okay. I have a high enough profile. I have people supporting me that are high profile themselves. Barry Weiss wrote a piece about me. Hundreds of professors signed a letter in my support. It's a different kind of cancellation than kind of the average person who donates $20 or $100 to the Prop 8 campaign in California against gay marriage, and all of a sudden, jobs boycotted or they get fired from their job at whatever company. That's I think more significant and probably more illiberal. In a sense, I'm a public figure. I can take the heat. It certainly was unpleasant. Those first few days were pretty hellish. Not just the Twitter mob, but just threatening my career and all of that. But there is, I think, an inability to excuse people's mistakes and to have conversations about controversial topics. The state of our national discourse is exceedingly poor, and that's a much broader issue than simply things that are going on college campuses or on social media.
For the longest time, especially for the past year, there have been people calling out comedians for making offensive jokes. And the precedent was just set the other day that a comedian finally got punched for saying something that someone didn't like.
Well, let's be clear. People say that silence is violence or words are violence, but then violence in the right cause is not violence or something. Violence is speech. I mean, it's that kind of Orwellian doublespeak is extremely dangerous. And, whatever one wants to think about Will Smith, he actually engaged in something physical. It wasn't just words or insults or offending somebody or quote unquote hate speech.
Yeah, and I know you see it with cancel culture or whatever we're going to call it. Gotten to a point where, and this even was the same 2 years ago, people are going back on Twitter by 10 years just trying to find one single incriminating thing that could smear that person or work against that person. And it's just the people who are doing that, I feel like they could, if they use that time for something really productive, we'd live in a much better world.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, I think we'd be in a better world if Twitter didn't exist. That's
agree.
For sure.
Recently, I think it was about a year ago, you ran for, I think was it the school board in Fairfax County. So just to move on for the last 10 minutes or so I want to move on to talk a little bit about education. I know that you are a big supporter of school vouchers, charter schools, school choice. I recall your words on your last appearance on here was that it is the civil rights issue of our time. Do you want to go into a little more detail about that? And additionally, do you want to explain how your campaign ultimately went?
Yeah, my school board run, I won in that I don't have to serve on school board now. I detailed the whole experience and lessons learned in a cover story for the Washington Examiner. You can look that up. Basically, there were 7 candidates for 4 slots. No incumbents ran for re-election, so there was dissatisfaction in the community. Still, it's a limousine liberal place. This is Falls Church City, Virginia, a very small jurisdiction, 15,000 people, about 10,000 voters, wedged between Arlington County and Fairfax County, which are the ones that have gotten a lot of publicity in the last few years. And the four more establishment-y type candidates won, and then there was a gap, and then there's the three of us who are more reformers. So that was eye-opening in a certain sense. And there have been some skirmishes over masks and the new governor's order earlier in the year about masks in schools. And I'm sure we'll be fighting about CRT and other issues. But yeah, school choice and the ability to guide your kids' education is, I think, the civil rights issue of our time. Look at the fight now in Florida over this parental rights bill, which has been I think unfairly derided as "don't say gay" by the left and the media, but we wouldn't be having that fight if there was more school choice, and all parents could figure out exactly what kind of education to get for their kids. So this is certainly an issue that's not going away; is only increasing. COVID, I think, accelerated it or made the scales fall from the eyes of a lot of people on education and parental rights and seeing exactly what their kids were learning. But this is a growing issue.
Yeah, I know. The thing that I just don't understand is why there's a scary amount of people I've seen, like either writing op-eds or just making posts on Twitter about it, and people like on Twitter, like blue checkmark people, so people who are actually like part of the media or whatever, actually speaking against parents having a say in their children's education.
There's a flavor of political argument that says schools are civilizing institutions that are meant to inculcate young members of society with the common values. And so, the idea is it takes a village, and it's the community that's responsible for educating and civilizing the kids. And parents are obviously very important, and they provide and they nurture, but the educational function is of the community. That is the argument.
Okay. Yeah. Then it seems like the best compromise would be, because I know like the concept of school vouchers, even though it was popularized, I believe, by Milton Friedman.
Most school choice is now done not with vouchers, but with tax credits. So there's different mechanisms. They're actually legally easier to put through, less entanglement with state funds going to religious schools and all of this sort of thing. But anyway, it did originate with Milton Friedman, and it would dissipate a whole host of clash points, whether we're talking about sex education, whether we're talking about teaching evolution, CRT, whatever curriculum battles there are would essentially go away if it wasn't the state imposing their preferred views on a given cohort.
With the origins of a school choice, what I think would be a nice compromise is you go back, and I forget if it was in Principles of Political Economy, but back in the 1860s, John Stuart Mill was talking about how the government should not administer education, but they should provide education, with regards to similar idea to tax credits and that sort of thing. Wouldn't that be like a good middle ground? Because you'd think that the government, or the state, ultimately there's kind of a conflict of interest there.
If you're asking whether it would be better policy to get rid of government-run schools and just provide each child with a certain amount of money to take to whatever school his or her parents want to send them, I think that would be an improvement. Yes.
And then do you think a big part of that controversy is also because they might be going to like religious schools as well?
Absolutely. People don't want to give up control over other people's kids.
So yeah, one final thing, especially because for the past year, this has been a big topic of discussion, but critical race praxis. I know you're a legal scholar. It did originate as a legal theory. I feel like there's a lot of confusion, especially on both sides, as to what constitutes as CRT. It seems like a lot of the time you have people on the right who are just calling everything, like using it as a blanket term to refer to a bunch of things. And like the only thing that they are correct about CRT is that it is dangerous. But then you have people on the other side of the spectrum who are saying, oh no, we're just teaching history or whatever. Or and then they're saying, no, but we're not teaching little kids like these complex legal theories. But then the counter argument to that is no, but they're sort of like sneaking in these basic ideas.
I don't think we need to get a perfect definition of what CRT is and isn't, and what it might mean for any given age level or what have you. The point is, teaching history, teaching facts is never wrong. In fact, it's a good thing for kids to have a full understanding of American history, world history, their state, all of that sort of thing. Whether it's slavery going back to Mesopotamia, whether it's the civil rights era, all of that is good. What's not good is racial essentialism, saying that the most important characteristic of someone is whether they're from an oppressed or an oppressor class, segregating kids based on skin color, hair color, that sort of thing, teaching them guilt, teaching them to check their privilege and have privilege hierarchies. All of these, what started as academic theories have filtered down even to kindergartens, and that's unfortunate. And that's very different from teaching history. That's teaching racialist attitudes and activism.
In a lot of ways, it kind of seems like unintentionally the reverse of early 20th century, the racial essentialists, like people like Madison Grant, who are trying to sort of classify all these different races into the different groups and talking about how there's basically a hierarchy and a structure, but on the complete opposite.
There are memes online and little videos about guess whether this is a white supremacist because they essentially agree on a lot of facts about the racial essentiality. Yeah.
In the shortest way possible, and I promise the last question before I let you go. CRT, in short, in layman's terms, how would you describe it? And what do people on the right who are constantly talking about it, what do they get wrong about it? What do they get right about it?
I'm not a CRT scholar, but the point is you don't have to define it specifically. Okay. And if you want to learn more about it, you have to be in a law school or in a political science department or a sociology department and as a grad student or something. But the point is, for K-12 education, teaching history, that's not CRT. Okay. Correct history. I mean, we can have an argument about whether 1619, what's wrong about the 1619 project and its flaws and things like that. But that's a debate about what the proper history is. CRT is forcing kids to analyze the world through a racial lens. And there's other critical studies. There's critical gender studies. There's critical sexuality studies, looking at systems rather than individuals. The United States is irredeemably racist. Systemic racism can never be eradicated, and everyone has to continually work to be actively anti-racist, and just being non-racist is not good enough. You have these conceptions of equity rather than equality, equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. These nefarious ideas that people should always be evaluated through a racial or gender or other lens that has nothing to do with someone's intellect or character or behavior.
I 100% agree with that. And especially as a history buff, I wish that you could just hand classroom Arnold Toynbee or something and learn from that, as opposed to trying to turn history into some sort of ideological game of some sort.
I'm just a simple constitutional lawyer, that philosophizing, that's above my pay grade.
Well, either way, thank you so much for coming on. Again, everybody, Ilya Shapiro, author of Supreme Disorder, coming out in paperback, you said
July 5th.
Are you working on any other projects potentially too for the future that you feel comfortable saying?
I'm speaking a lot these days and writing. You can see my op-eds from time to time on issues of free speech on campus, civil public discourse, cancel culture, these sorts of things. Wasn't expecting to have quite so much practical experience with these issues, but nevertheless, here we are.
I mean, there's always the oasis of Mason's econ department, but well, anyway, again, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure having you. And also thank you for being my first returning guest. You have a fantastic day.
You too. Take care.